In the summer of 2017, a demolition crew broke through a false wall in a condemned warehouse on the outskirts of St. Joseph, Missouri, and found a room that did not exist on any blueprint. No windows, no door, no way in except the hole they had just made. Inside, stacked on partially collapsed shelving and sealed in oilcloth, waxed paper, and metal tins, were 20 distinct sets of records, some inscribed on clay tablets, some on treated animal hide, some on birch bark bound with sinew, some on hammered copper, some in formats that the workers on scene described as nothing they had ever encountered in their lives. The building had been constructed in 1931 and had changed hands 9 times. Its last owner, a bankrupt agricultural company, had abandoned it in 2004. Nobody who worked there ever mentioned a sealed room. Nobody who sold the building ever disclosed one. The room and everything inside it had simply been there, waiting, while normal life went on around it for decades. When the County Historical Society arrived and called the university, and the university called its archaeologists, and the archaeologists ran radiocarbon dating on the organic materials, the lead researcher read the results twice. Then a third time. The dates ranged from approximately 400 years ago to more than 2,000 years in the past. 2,000 years. And the warehouse sat less than 200 yards from the Missouri River, at a point where the river had been a major artery of indigenous trade and movement for millennia before a single European set foot on this continent. 20 records assembled across 20 centuries, sealed inside a wall, never catalogued, never publicized, never taught. What I am about to tell you has been examined by credentialed researchers, documented in academic papers, and presented at conferences where the audience went very quiet. None of it is in any textbook. None of it is in any museum exhibit the general public can visit. Some of what is inside these records makes the standard story of North American prehistory not just incomplete, but demonstrably wrong. Stay with me through all 20 of these records. Subscribe right now if you haven't. Because number 1 is the document that the lead researcher described in a private letter to her closest colleague as the one she thinks about every single night before she goes to sleep. Not because she cannot explain it, because she is not certain the world is ready for what it means. Record 20 is the record that set the timeline and established that everything else in that room was connected. It was a clay tablet roughly the size of a hardcover book, fired at high temperature, and then coated in a thin layer of pine resin that had preserved its surface in extraordinary condition. The inscriptions covered both faces and both long edges, incised with a stylus into the clay before firing. The symbols fell into 2 categories. The first was numerical, organized in rows that archaeologists identified as a base 20 counting system, a mathematical structure known from the pre-Columbian cultures of Mesoamerica, but not commonly associated with the northern Great Plains. The second category was pictographic and the images were geographic. Rivers, tributary junctions, a large landmass bisected by a snaking line. The geographers who examined high-resolution photographs spent 2 full days comparing the pictographs to actual topography before arriving at a reading that none of them were entirely comfortable putting in writing. The tablet appears to represent the Missouri-Mississippi River system from roughly the Montana headwaters down to the confluence near modern St. Louis, rendered with a spatial accuracy that implies either direct survey or the synthesis of accumulated travel knowledge built up over many generations. The radiocarbon dating of organic material embedded in the resin coating placed this tablet at approximately 200 BCE, give or take 80 years. Someone was mapping this river system 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, not sketching it, not approximating it, mapping it, with a base 20 mathematical notation system that shared structural features with traditions 1,000 miles to the south, in a location that the standard narrative treats as empty space. Record 19 was a bundle of birch bark sheets, 12 of them, each roughly 8 by 10 inches, sewn together along one edge with fine sinew in a format that functions exactly like a book. The inner face of each sheet had been scraped thin and treated with bear fat, a traditional preservative used by many indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region, which had kept the pages in remarkable condition for something that should by rights have turned to dust centuries ago. The writing was dense and consistent throughout, the same hand on every page, suggesting a single author working across an extended period of time. The symbols used were entirely distinct from those on the clay tablet, but showed the internal regularities that linguists recognize as characteristic of a genuine writing system: grammatical markers, recurring root forms, positional rules. The content could not be deciphered, but the structure could be analyzed. Based on symbol frequency, variation patterns, and the organizational features of the text, the researchers concluded that this document most closely resembles a personal record or journal, the kind of first-person account a traveler or careful observer might keep over months or years. The radiocarbon dating placed these pages at approximately 900 CE, 7 centuries after the clay tablet. Two different people, 7 centuries apart, chose this same stretch of the Missouri River to preserve written records. That pattern will continue through every item in this room. It is not coincidence. Something about this location made it the place where knowledge was kept. Record 18 was the first object in the collection to carry unambiguous evidence of a trade or communication network spanning enormous distances. It was a sheet of hammered copper, about 9 by 12 inches, covered on one face with deeply incised symbols, and on the other with a detailed figural design worked in repoussé, raised from the back so the image stands in relief. The design showed a large bird with spread wings and a human figure suspended beneath it, a thunderbird motif that specialists in Native American iconography recognized immediately as a variant of cosmological imagery found across a vast range of the continent. But the copper itself was the real revelation. Isotopic analysis traced it unambiguously to the Keweenaw Peninsula in Michigan, the largest deposit of pure native copper on Earth. Someone transported this metal approximately 900 miles overland or by river to a site in Missouri, worked it into a document, and arranged for its preservation, alongside objects that would not be assembled for another 1,000 years. The symbols on the inscribed face partially overlap with symbols from the birchbark journal, but show enough divergence to suggest either a different dialect of the same writing system or a deliberate stylistic choice. This copper sheet is evidence that whoever was keeping records along the Missouri River was in active communication with people at the far edges of the continent. The knowledge being preserved in this room was not local knowledge. It was the knowledge of a connected world. Record 17 was a rolled cylinder of treated deer hide, tied with a leather cord and sealed inside a copper tube crimped shut at both ends. Opening it required 4 careful hours and the dissolution of oxidized copper at the seams. Inside was a single continuous document, the hide cut and joined to create a surface roughly 3 feet long and 8 inches wide, covered edge to edge in fine, precise markings. The hide had been treated with a combination of tallow and mineral salts identified by the chemists as a deliberate preservation method, not a byproduct of use. It had worked extraordinarily well. The markings on this document were unlike anything else in the collection. Precise geometric forms, circles and triangles and careful subdivisions, alongside numerical sequences and what appear to be measurement ratios. One mathematician who reviewed the photographs spent 3 weeks with the document before reaching a conclusion that he published very quietly in a small journal that most people will never read. His conclusion was that portions of this document appear to encode proportional relationships between the lengths of specific river segments and their tributaries, a form of applied mathematics that would allow reconstruction of distances without a drawn map. Not by guessing, by calculation. This is not primitive record-keeping. This is surveying. This is the mathematical infrastructure of a civilization that was doing things we decided they couldn't do. Record 16 was a set of 6 clay tablets, each about 4 by 6 inches, found still stacked in their original order inside a degraded wooden box. Unlike the large map tablet of Record 20, these were sun-dried rather than fired, which should have made them fragile, but the sealed environment had kept them intact. Each tablet carried what appeared to be a list, consistent groupings of symbols separated by clear dividers, with numerical notations alongside many entries. The archaeobotanist on the team was the first to suggest what they were. The pattern, the groupings, the numbers, the structure, it matched the format of a plant or seed inventory, a record of agricultural or medicinal materials cataloged by type and quantity. If this reading is correct, and the team found no better explanation, These tablets represent the records of a storehouse or repository. They are the inventory of a warehouse. And they were found, 2,000 years later, inside a warehouse, 200 yards from the same river. The research team noted that irony without elaboration. But I want to elaborate on it, because the implication is not merely interesting, it is disorienting. The location where these records were hidden was not chosen randomly. It had been a place of organized storage and record-keeping for 2,000 years. The people who built that 1931 warehouse had no idea they were building it on the same site, for the same purpose, as something that existed before the Roman Empire. Record 15 is where the collection began to pull in directions that made the more cautious members of the research team visibly uncomfortable, and where the story of these records started showing up in academic whisper networks before any formal publication. It was a flat piece of local limestone, about 12 by 8 inches, covered on one face with incised astronomical notations. The team's astronomer identified the content within an hour of receiving the photographs. The tablet recorded solar and lunar cycle information, solstice and equinox markers, lunar phase counts, and a series of eclipse predictions rendered in a notation system that was structurally consistent with astronomical record-keeping from Mesoamerican traditions that preceded the Maya. Whether this represents direct contact, parallel development, or transmission through intermediate cultures, no one has been willing to say publicly. What they have been willing to say is this: the eclipse predictions on this tablet are accurate. The astronomer checked 4 of them against modern astronomical calculations. All 4 correspond to real eclipse events, 2 solar and 2 lunar, visible from the Missouri Valley within a specific 200-year window. Someone was watching the sky from this river with enough precision and continuity to build predictive models. That requires generations of careful observation and a method of recording and transmitting the results so that each observer could build on what the last one left behind. Drop a comment right now and tell me what you think that implies about the level of social organization required to maintain that kind of knowledge across multiple generations. Because I think about that question constantly, and I want to know if you do too. Record 14 was a large sheet of birch bark, unbound and unrolled, roughly 18 by 24 inches, covered in what the team came to describe, with considerable academic caution, as a census. The symbols used matched those from the birch bark journal of Record 19, strongly suggesting they were products of the same tradition and possibly the same community. The content appeared to consist of named or identified groups, each followed by numerical tallies, followed by what might be place designations. If the reading is correct, this document records the enumeration of multiple distinct groups, possibly family units or clans, at named locations along the Missouri River corridor. The total numbers implied by the tallies, when summed, suggest a population in the low thousands distributed across dozens of named sites. That is not the picture of small, scattered, isolated bands that conventional accounts of pre-Columbian Missouri typically present. That is a documented, enumerated, named population living in an organized territorial system complex enough to require written population records. The fact that they were keeping those records is not a small thing. You do not maintain a written census of your population unless you have the administrative infrastructure to collect that information, process it, and store it somewhere accessible. You do not do that unless you have a governing system sophisticated enough to need the numbers. This document implies a political entity, and that political entity is nowhere in the history books. Record 13 was a copper plate that stood out even in this extraordinary collection because of what was on its reverse side. The front carried repoussé figural imagery, showing what appeared to be a formal gathering. Multiple human figures seated in a circle around a central object, an image the team interpreted as a council or ceremonial assembly. But the back of the plate had been used as a writing surface, and the inscription there was dense and urgent in a way that the conservators noticed before any analysis had been done. The symbols were packed more tightly than in any other document in the collection. The margins were used. The writing appeared to continue around the edges. One epigrapher who spent a week with the photographs described it as having the quality of something written under pressure, the record of a person who had a great deal to say and was uncertain whether they would have the chance to say it again. The inscription on the back of this copper plate is the longest continuous piece of writing in the entire collection. It has not been deciphered. It may never be. But it was placed here deliberately, inside a sealed room, by someone who clearly intended it to survive. Whatever was written on the back of that plate, the person who wrote it knew that the moment they were living through was important enough to record even when the space to record it was running out. Subscribe right now if you haven't already, because we still have 12 records to cover, and the next one is the object that required the most security clearance to examine after the initial discovery. Record 12 was a ceramic vessel, sealed with a fitted clay cap that had been fired in place, making it essentially a single object that required a conservator working under magnification with a microdrill for an entire afternoon before the interior was accessible. The vessel, roughly the size of a large mason jar, was decorated on the exterior with incised symbols that matched a third writing system, distinct from both the birch bark tradition and the copper tradition, meaning this collection contains evidence of at least 3 separate literate or semi-literate traditions operating in contact with each other in the Missouri River Valley. Inside the vessel, preserved by the airtight seal, were 43 small clay discs, each inscribed on both faces, none of them identical. The discs showed clear signs of handling, smooth edges and polished high points, suggesting they had been used and reused over a long period. The working theory among the researchers was that these were a set of reference tokens, a modular record-keeping system where discrete units of information could be selected, combined, and recombined to produce different meanings or records. The analogy one researcher used was a library in miniature, a portable, reorganizable body of knowledge. That analogy is actually not adequate, because what this vessel contains is evidence of an information technology, a deliberate design solution to the problem of how to store knowledge in a way that is both durable and flexible. Someone engineered this, and they sealed it in a ceramic jar and put it in a wall where it would be safe for 2,000 years. Record 11 was the collection's most direct evidence of long-distance human travel, not trade, but actual people moving across a continent and carrying their records with them. It was a small notebook made from 22 sheets of treated fish skin, each about 6 by 4 inches, bound along the left edge with twisted sinew. Fish skin, properly treated, is remarkably durable, which is why it survived. The species identification was what broke the room open. The ichthyologist consulted by the team identified the skin as coming from a large freshwater species consistent with Pacific salmon. Pacific salmon are not found in the Missouri River. They are found in rivers draining to the Pacific Ocean, primarily in the Northwest. Someone carried this notebook from the Pacific side of the continent to the Missouri Valley, or carried the raw materials to make it, or acquired it through a chain of exchange that stretched all the way to the Pacific coast. The content of the notebook, analyzed structurally, shows a sequence of entries that change in character over time, more sparse and hurried near the end, as if the writer was running short of space or short of time or both. The first entries are methodical. The last few are compressed. There is something in that compression, in the image of a person still writing even as the pages ran out, that I find impossible to shake. Whatever this person was recording, they did not stop until they had no space left to keep going. Record 10 was a flat stone slab of local sandstone covered on one face with a map, and not a symbolic or schematic map. A representational one, carved in relief with enough detail and spatial accuracy that the geographers on the team could orient it within 20 minutes of receiving photographs. It showed the Missouri River from approximately the modern North Dakota-Montana border to the confluence with the Mississippi, with major tributaries indicated, elevation changes suggested by graduated relief, and 17 marked points along the river's course. Those 17 marked points corresponded, with a precision that none of the researchers were comfortable calling coincidental, to locations that are archaeologically significant in the historical record. Known village sites, ceremonial mound complexes, quarry locations, river crossing points that were documented in historical periods as traditional crossing points. This map was not made by guessing. It was made by people who had traveled the entire length of this river system and recorded what they found at each significant stop. The scale is consistent throughout, which means the maker either had a standardized system of distance measurement or synthesized records from multiple travelers into a single unified document. Both options require organizational infrastructure. Both options require that someone was in charge of gathering information, comparing it, standardizing it, and committing the final result to stone. Comment below right now and tell me if anything remotely like this was in any textbook you ever read in school, because I want to know how many of us grew up being taught a version of this continent's history that was always missing half the story. Record 9 was the document that the materials scientists spent more time analyzing than any other object in the collection, not because it was the most complex, but because the material it was made from refused to make sense. It looked like vellum, the fine parchment made from young animal skin that was common in medieval Europe. But the species analysis came back wrong for any animal native to North America. The protein signature of the material, tested 3 times and confirmed on the 3rd, matched a species of deer found primarily in Central America and southern Mexico. Someone transported a document made from Central American deer hide to a warehouse room in Missouri. Or someone transported the raw hide north and made the document here, which means someone from Central America was present in Missouri. Or someone from Missouri had been to Central America and brought materials back. Or the document traveled through a chain of hands spanning 1,500 miles over an unknown period of time. The content of the document carried symbols consistent with the copper tradition seen in records 18 and 13, suggesting that it is part of the same body of knowledge regardless of where it was manufactured. What I want you to sit with for a moment is not the writing on this hide, but the fact that it exists here at all. This is not a bead. This is not a shell. This is not a piece of obsidian moving through a trade network. This is a document. Someone decided that what was written on this hide was important enough to carry 1,500 miles and preserve in a sealed room. Information had value. Information was worth protecting across a continent. Record 8 was the collection's clearest evidence of political or legal function, the record that forced the researchers to confront the possibility that what they were looking at was not just knowledge preservation, but governance. It was a clay tablet, medium-sized, carrying a long central inscription, flanked on both sides by impressed marks in a different and clearly distinct style, marks that the epigraphers recognized as consistent with personal identification seals, the kind of authenticating marks used in ancient Near Eastern administrative documents to certify that a specific individual had witnessed or authorized a specific text. The central inscription used the base 20 numerical system from the map tablet of Record 20 alongside what appear to be proper names rendered in the birchbark tradition's symbol set, a bilingual or hybrid document that drew on multiple writing traditions simultaneously. The combination of an authenticated central text with flanking witness seals is structurally identical to the format used for contracts, treaties, and formal agreements across multiple literate societies in the ancient world. No member of the research team published the word treaty in connection with this document. But no member of the research team was able to identify any other function that would produce this specific structural form. Someone wrote a formal agreement, had it witnessed, had the witnesses authenticate their presence by pressing their personal marks into the clay, and then preserved that authenticated document in a sealed room where it would be safe, where it would survive, where it could be retrieved. By whom? For what purpose? Those questions have not been answered. Record 7 was a set of thin white cedar boards, 6 of them, each about 10 by 6 inches, joined with leather hinges in an accordion fold that could be stacked flat or opened into a continuous surface nearly 5 feet long. The cedar came from the Great Lakes region, consistent with the birch bark materials, and the boards had been coated on their writing faces with a fine white clay slip that provided a smooth, even surface for the incised symbols. The content spanned all 6 boards as a continuous text, the symbols flowing from the end of one board to the beginning of the next without interruption or break. This is the closest thing in the collection to what we would recognize as a book in the full sense, a sustained piece of writing designed to be read from beginning to end, with no interruptions in the argument or the narrative. The symbols mixed elements from multiple traditions found elsewhere in the collection, which one researcher interpreted as evidence of a writer who was literate in more than one system, someone who had been educated in multiple written traditions and chose to work in a hybrid form that drew on all of them. Think about what it takes to produce a person like that. Not just the intelligence, which was obviously present, the institutional infrastructure, the teachers, the texts, the time, the stable conditions under which deep learning can happen. Whoever wrote on these cedar boards did not appear from nowhere. They were the product of a culture that had been investing in literacy for a very long time. Record 6 was the strangest object in the collection by a significant margin, and in a room that contained a Pacific salmon skin notebook and a possible intercultural treaty witnessed by personal seals. That is not a small claim. It was a ceramic cylinder, about 8 inches tall and 3 inches in diameter, sealed at both ends with fired clay plugs. Inside, after careful cutting, was a tightly coiled roll of very thin copper foil, about 18 inches long when fully extended, covered in microscopic symbols and sized with what must have been an extraordinarily fine tool, possibly a sharpened bone or thorn. Under magnification, the symbols were perfectly formed and perfectly consistent in size across the entire length of the foil. The kind of precision required to inscribe symbols at that scale without optical tools is difficult to explain. A lens, a very steady hand working under intense natural light, a method of training that pushed fine motor control to a level most people today have never tried to achieve. The content, partially analyzed through photographic enhancement, appears to be a list, possibly of names or locations, rendered in a symbol set that partially matches the copper tradition, but includes elements found nowhere else in the entire collection. This is unique information that exists nowhere else in this room, compressed into a space smaller than a bookmark, sealed inside a cylinder, hidden inside a jar. Whoever made this did not want what was on it to be read by just anyone. They wanted it to survive. There is a difference. Record 5 was the object that attracted the most attention when word of this collection first began to circulate in academic networks, and the object that generated the most controversy. Not because anyone disproved the initial interpretation, but because the initial interpretation made people deeply uncomfortable. It was a flat birch bark sheet, about 14 by 10 inches, covered in a single continuous diagram. Concentric circles with radiating lines, nested squares at specific points on the circles, small numerical notations at each intersection, and a central mark consistent with representations of the sun across multiple pre-Columbian iconographic traditions. The interpretation that spread quickly through the academic grapevine was offered by an archaeoastronomist who had spent 20 years studying pre-Columbian observatory sites across North America. In her reading, this diagram is a planning or recording document for a site alignment, the calculations needed to orient a structure so that specific solar and stellar events would be visible from specific vantage points at specific times of year. Someone along the Missouri River was designing, or had designed, or was recording the design of, an astronomical observatory. The controversy arose not because anyone showed her reading was wrong. It arose because several senior researchers argued that the implications were too significant to publish without additional supporting evidence from other sites. Those senior researchers are still waiting for additional supporting evidence. The document still exists, the diagram is still there, and no one has offered a better explanation for what those concentric circles and numerical notations mean. Record 4 was a bundle of 20 small clay tablets, each about 3 by 4 inches, found carefully stacked and wrapped in mineralized oilcloth inside a degraded wooden box. The tablets were uniform in size and manufacture, but varied in content, each carrying a small number of symbols in a standardized format, a symbol or short group of symbols above a horizontal line, and a longer passage below it. This consistent two-part structure across all 20 tablets suggested strongly to the researchers that what they were looking at was a reference document, something like a glossary or key, with a term above the line and a definition or explanation below it. If this reading is correct, these 20 tablets are a decipherment key. They are the document that, if a linguist could establish the phonetic or semantic value of even a handful of the top-line entries, could unlock the entire birch bark writing system. 3 separate research groups have attempted exactly that. None has published results. The tablets have been photographed extensively, but physical access has been restricted to a small number of researchers under conditions that have not been fully disclosed. There are 2 ways to interpret that restriction. One is that the tablets are fragile and the conservation protocols are rigorous. The other is that someone knows what they say and is not ready for the rest of us to know it too. I am not in a position to tell you which interpretation is correct. I am in a position to tell you that the restriction exists and that you should form your own opinion about what that means. Record 3 was a copper sheet, the largest metalwork in the collection, at roughly 16 by 24 inches, covered on both faces with what can only be described as the administrative records of a large and complex organization. The front face carried what appeared to be an organizational hierarchy, symbols connected by incised lines in a branching structure that the anthropologists compared to the diagrams of clan relationships and political authority that ethnographers documented among historically known indigenous confederacies of the Northeast and Great Plains. The back face carried what appeared to be a resource inventory, lists of materials and quantities organized by location. Front and back together present an integrated picture, a governing structure on one side, and the material resources that structure managed on the other. This is the record of a polity, not a band, not a loose collection of related families. A polity with a hierarchy, a territorial range, a system for tracking and redistributing material wealth, and the administrative practice of committing all of that to writing on a durable surface that could survive being examined by strangers centuries later. This document, on its own, rewrites the standard historical account of pre-Columbian Missouri. Combined with everything else in that room, it is part of a picture that most people in this country have never been given the opportunity to see. Record 2 was the last document cataloged before the lead researcher encountered the one that stopped her in place. It was a set of 11 treated bison hide pages, each about 9 by 12 inches, bound with copper wire along the left edge. The bison hide was local, consistent with a Missouri Valley origin, but the preservation treatment matched the method used on the Pacific Salmon Skin Notebook of Record 11, a technique associated with Northwest Coast traditions, and found here applied to a Great Plains material. The content of these pages was the most visually striking in the entire collection. Every page was covered not with text, but with detailed illustrations, rendered in red and black pigments that had survived 800 years in conditions that would have destroyed most modern materials. The illustrations showed human figures in a sustained narrative sequence, carrying specific objects, traveling in a specific direction, interacting with specific landscapes and specific other figures. The visual storytelling was sophisticated enough that the art historians on the team could follow the basic structure of the narrative, even without understanding the textual captions that accompanied some of the illustrations. Someone was telling a story, a long story, with characters and a journey and objects of significance and a destination. They were telling it in pictures that were meant to last. They succeeded. That story still exists, still readable in its broad outlines, 8 centuries after the person who made it put down their brush and sealed it behind a false wall in Missouri. And now, we reach Record 1. This is the document the lead researcher described in a private letter to her closest colleague, written 3 months after the initial examination, as the one she thinks about every night before she falls asleep. Not because she cannot explain it, because she is not sure how to explain it in a way that the world is prepared to receive. It was found at the back of the sealed room, set apart from everything else, elevated on a purpose-built stand of river stones arranged with obvious and careful intention. It was wrapped in 7 layers of material, an outer shell of fired clay tiles sealed with pine resin, then woven plant fiber, then tanned hide, then hammered copper sheets, then fine birch bark, then cedar boards, and finally, as the innermost layer, a wrapping of treated silk. Silk. In Missouri. The silk was analyzed and confirmed as genuine, consistent with Bombyx mori, the domesticated silk moth whose cultivation originated in China and spread through trade networks that had reached Europe and Japan by the centuries when this document was sealed. How silk arrived in Missouri is a question to which no researcher has yet offered a satisfactory published answer. Inside the 7 layers was a document of 43 pages made from treated deer hide, bound with fine copper wire, written in a symbol system that incorporated elements from every other writing tradition present in the collection. Every tradition. The birch bark symbols, the copper symbols, the base 20 mathematical notation, The astronomical notation. Elements from the third ceramic tradition and the micro-inscription on the copper foil. All of them, woven together into a single unified document. The lead researcher's informal interpretation, which she has shared privately but not yet published, is that this document is a deliberate synthesis, an attempt by a single author to create a unified record drawing on every written tradition that had been represented in this room over 2,000 years, possibly intended for an audience that came from more than one of those traditions. The pages appear to be organized into 4 sections of roughly equal length. The symbol density is consistent throughout, suggesting a sustained argument or account, rather than a list or inventory. The illustrations that appear across several pages, rendered in the same style as the narrative hidebook of Record 2, show figures gathered around a fire, passing an object between them, pointing toward a river, pointing toward the sky. The lead researcher sat in the conservation lab with this document for 6 hours on the day she first examined it. When she came out, she told her graduate student that she thought she understood, at least structurally, what the author was trying to do. She thought the author was trying to write down everything. Every system of knowledge. Every way of recording and understanding the world. Every tradition that the people of this river had accumulated and maintained and passed forward over 20 centuries. She thought it was a deliberate act of preservation, made not for the people of that time, but for whoever came later. The silk wrapping, and the stone stand and the 7 protective layers were not the actions of someone hiding a secret. They were the actions of someone making a gift. A gift for strangers in a future they knew they would not live to see. From a civilization that understood, at the moment it sealed this room, that what it had built was worth saving. The document is currently in climate-controlled storage. Full publication of the collection remains pending. The decipherment work continues. Here is what I want you to carry out of this video. In a single sealed room in a Missouri warehouse, researchers found evidence of at least 3 distinct writing systems in active use across 2,000 years. Applied mathematics sophisticated enough to encode proportional geographic measurements. Astronomical observation precise enough to predict real eclipses. Long-distance networks connecting the Missouri Valley to the Pacific, to Mesoamerica, and possibly beyond. A formal political structure with administrative records. A written population census. A witnessed formal agreement. A detailed river map. A portable modular information technology. And a final synthesizing document wrapped in silk from the other side of the world, written by someone who knew they were at the end of something and refused to let it disappear. Every single one of these objects has been examined by credentialed researchers. Every single one is documented. None of it is in a textbook. None of it is in a museum the public can walk into. The next time someone tells you the story of this continent began with European contact, you now have 20 specific documented objects to point to. Drop a comment and tell me which of these 20 records hit you hardest. Tell me which one you are still thinking about. The comments on this channel are one of the main reasons I keep making these videos, and I mean that completely. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with one person who thinks they know the full story of North America. They don't. None of us do. But we are getting closer, one sealed room at a time.